All right, folks, we are back for episode 2 of Slam Wars. If you didn't catch episode 1, where we looked at the VLX3, I would highly recommend pausing this and giving that a watch now, at very least the first 30 minutes. This video will be building directly on that and comparing the star of today's show, Z&F's FlexScan 22, to NavVis's VLX3. Right off the bat, I have to say this has to be one of the most unique SLAM scanners I've ever used. Z&F essentially built a mobile mapping SLAM platform that connects an IMU and 360-degree camera to their newer static scanners. It allows you to use SLAM when you have a need for speed, and when you want higher accuracy and reduced noise, you can finish your SLAM data acquisition and start taking static terrestrial scans. It's a very interesting idea. You seemingly get the best of both worlds. In my experience, most outfits that do a lot of 3D scanning have both a SLAM and terrestrial laser scanner. SLAM is faster in the field and generally in the office. Terrestrial is usually more accurate, more reliable, more precise, and preserves detail better. On paper, this seems like an ideal solution, and being able to capture and process all your scan data in a single ecosystem is very attractive. You don't have to buy 2 different scanners, which means you don't have to buy 2 different software packages and learn how to capture and process data from 2 different manufacturers. So if it's such a great idea, why aren't other 3D scanning manufacturers jumping on the dual-use bandwagon? There's got to be a trade-off somewhere, and I wasn't going to find it reading spec sheets or marketing material. You probably already see where this is going. Time to hit the streets and put the FlexScan to the test. We're going to cut right to the chase on this video and jump right into the accuracy testing results for the FlexScan. Just like when I reviewed Leica's RTC360, Riegl's VZ600i, and NavVis's VLX3 on this exact same test site, I'll be using the one-dimensional method for point cloud accuracy determination using the 120 independent check shots on site that create well over 2,000 check baselines. If you're not familiar with this methodology, my video titled Measuring Point Cloud Accuracy, One-Dimensional Method should clear up any questions. If we look back to episode 1 of Slam Wars, we saw that after NavVis reprocessed their point cloud, they obtained levels of accuracy on planar features that were equal to terrestrial scanning, which in all honesty, I was not expecting. I think a lot of this had to do with the amount of high quality control used and the very thorough capture methodology by NavVis. Unfortunately for Z&F, they were stuck with me capturing this dataset using a scanner I had only used once prior to this test. And for reasons that I will expand on in just a moment, mistakes were made in the field capture side of things. Mistakes that weren't caught until after I sent the scanner back. So with that asterisk, let's see how the FlexScan stacks up against the VLX3 in terms of accuracy on planar features. Horizontally, the standard deviations of the residuals are almost identical to the VLX3. I calculated 2 to 3 millimeters in the northern and eastern axes with max deviations of 9 and 15 millimeters. As for elevations, that's where that asterisk comes into play. While I was capturing one of the datasets, I had someone come over and start talking to me about the scanner. So I paused the data acquisition to answer his questions, and when I restarted it, there was a delay between when I thought the scanner was collecting data and when it actually started collecting data. As such, that resulted in a slam break, which could only be fixed by breaking that particular dataset in two and removing the affected area. And to make things worse, there was no control anywhere on that particular dataset to help sort that walk out. The results of this was duplicated walls and ceilings right around the area of the break, which in turn produced vertical residuals misrepresentative of what the FlexScan should be capable of. The check shots that landed in areas without duplicated floors and ceilings hit fantastically in the range of a couple millimeters, on par with what was observed horizontally, but the check shots that landed in the area of duplication saw residuals of almost 2 inches, which is to be expected. It is kind of interesting how I saw almost identical issues between the first VLX3 dataset and this dataset from the FlexScan, albeit for two different reasons. But like I said in episode 1, SLAM does a lot of things well, but for now, the reliability of terrestrial scanning is an advantage worth repeating. I do need to note that when the dataset came back with issues, I offered to let Z&F reprocess it with a caveat I would have to mention the issue seen in the first go around, and they insisted that I move ahead with the dataset as is. It was their philosophy that they want to showcase the data that one could expect to see any day of the week, the good, and in this case, especially the bad. Not something that has been filtered and cleaned up to high heaven, resulting in a beautiful but unrealistic dataset. Reliability isn't the sole advantage terrestrial scanning holds over SLAM. When comparing the VLX dataset to those from the RTC or the VZ600i, it's clear that terrestrial scanning offers significantly higher point cloud fidelity and excels at capturing complex geometry. In contrast, the VLX tended to round off sharp edges and smooth out finer details such as conduit and posts, making it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to accurately digitize smaller features. Overall, SLAM-based systems like the VLX often struggle with intricate and detailed geometry. When speaking with Z&F prior to capturing any data, it was very interesting to me how confident they were about FlexScan's ability to overcome these issues, and as such, I could not wait to see how it actually performed. Let's jump back into NForce and cut those exact same cross-sections that we looked at in episode 1. Again, we have the VLX in navy blue, the RTC360 in cyan, and this time I've added the FlexScan in magenta. Just a heads up, you'll see a slight but consistent shift in the FlexScan data in the north axis that didn't affect relative accuracy at all. The first section is some electrical conduit in the corner of a wall. The VLX more or less merged it right into the corner without any real delineation of a round pipe. There's a bit of a hump, but that's about it. Now, when we look at the FlexScan data, I would go as far as saying that it retained as much true geometry of that conduit as the RTC did. Not only that, but the walls to the left and right of that conduit have about the same amount of noise or less as the RTC and about nearly half that of the VLX. Next up is the corner of the elevator entrance trim that was polished stainless steel. It's always a tough situation for any 3D scanner when working with highly reflective surfaces. The FlexScan really struggled here. The RTC did the best job, the VLX was second best, and the FlexScan did marginally better than Riegl's VZ600i, which we looked at last episode, shown here in red. This is some more vertical conduit, but this time out in the open and leading up to an outlet box. Again, the VLX smoothed it out to a point digitization would be questionable at best. But the FlexScan did about as good of a job as the RTC did, and when we get to the outlet box, the FlexScan also preserved the shape of the outlet box without rounding it off too much. This section is a typical example of a sharp corner that SLAM is known for rounding out. This example is very indicative of the many cross-sections I checked on this dataset, where the FlexScan did not really round off corners in the way the VLX did and the way I was expecting it to. This example was that exit sign that had conduit leading up to it and posts holding it up. A lot of small features packed in tightly together, and the trend continued. The VLX struggled quite a bit with a fair amount of noise and artifacts, but the FlexScan doesn't look too dissimilar to the RTC data, which so far has been the gold standard on this site. And for the last example, the large diameter PVC water drain pipes. On this one, the FlexScan is a bit noisier than the RTC in some places, others it's about the same, and the VLX did a pretty good job here for the most part, but I think overall, the FlexScan might edge out a victory here as well over the VLX, but it's very close. In these examples and the many other cross-sections I pulled across this test site, the FlexScan did not look like SLAM data. It preserved complex geometry, small features, and didn't round out corners. When viewing the FlexScan data by section, it looked a lot more like terrestrial scan data than it did SLAM data. So what exactly is going on here? Why are we seeing such a stark contrast in the ability of these SLAM scanners to map small features and complex geometry? Well, I think there are probably a couple factors at work here. One would be on the software side of things, and I think the amount of filtering and smoothing Ivion does plays a factor in what we're seeing. And on the hardware side, these two scanners appear to have a significantly different beam divergence. The Z&F 5016 and 5024 both have a 1/e² value of 0.3 milliradians for the half angle. This equates to a relatively very tight laser beam with minimal spread. Finding the beam divergence value for Hesai's XT32 that the VLX uses wasn't as straightforward as they omit this information from their official spec sheet. I reached out to NavVis to see if they could answer this question, and they got back to me with a value of 0.21 degrees horizontally and 0.041 degrees vertically. We're getting two values here because Hesai's laser has an elliptical shape, and these values apply to the semi-major and semi-minor axis of that ellipse. Right off the bat, I thought it was odd that the semi-major axis would be over 4 times as big as the semi-minor, as that creates quite an oblong ellipse. So I decided to do some more digging. I found this 0.21 degree spec repeated a few more times from third-party suppliers of this sensor until I came across a different specification from LidarPayload.com. This is where things got interesting. They quote a spec of 0.021 degrees, or 1/10 what everyone else was using. Another source quotes a horizontal value of 0.04 and a vertical value of 0.10 degrees. If we convert the 0.21 degree value that NavVis quoted to milliradians, we get a value of 3.7. Keep in mind this spec more likely than not applies to the spread of the full beam. So this works out to a beam divergence of more than 5 times the FlexScan, 5 times Riegl's VZ600i, and about 3.5 larger than Leica's RTC. If we use the source that quotes the 0.10 value, we're looking at about 2.5 times the size of the FlexScan. And if we're looking at the source that quotes a 0.021 value, then that no longer becomes the semi-major axis, and the vertical value takes over for being the larger of the two at 0.041, which gives the XT32 a beam divergence very close to the FlexScan. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because beam divergence directly correlates to the spot size of the lasers the LiDAR sensor emits. And as spot size increases, the ability of the sensor to map smaller and more complex objects decreases. I reached out to a contact of mine with Recipe that has expertise in this very topic, and he informed me that he thought the 0.21 spec that NavVis told me was indeed an error and thought the 0.021 spec was correct, but he noted the value changes with range. It's still a bit of a mystery for me, and the real shame of this is that Hesai hasn't made this information more transparent, as this value is quite important and would affect the way people use their sensor. In episode 1, I made a comment about how I didn't believe the VLX3 would be capable of getting enough detail in a point cloud to define bolt heads, and how the RTC and VZ both did a great job of doing just that. Unfortunately, on this site, there weren't any exposed bolts for me to try and pick out of the point cloud, so I threw the challenge back to Z&F to see if they had any datasets that would fit the bill, and they did not disappoint. This point cloud was captured with the FlexScan, and the heads of these bolts are so well defined, you could probably measure the size of the socket needed to remove them. I was honestly shocked by this data, considering this came from SLAM. And if we look at this other data set on a church they scanned, the level of detail on the columns and wooden railing is just insane. If you showed these cross sections to someone and said this came from a terrestrial scanner, I don't think they would doubt that for a second. When it comes time for me to decide if we're going to slam a site or use terrestrial laser scanning, accuracy is a consideration, but an even bigger factor is the level of detail required. If we know we have to accurately extract features under 2 inches, we really try to avoid using SLAM. Considering what I've been seeing with the FlexScan, we would absolutely redefine the criteria that governs whether we choose to SLAM or use terrestrial laser scanning on a specific project. When we look at Z&F's point cloud and compare that to the VLX3's point cloud, there is a very obvious contrast in the aesthetics between the two. Like I said in episode 1, it's really hard to compete with NavVis in terms of a beautiful point cloud. The FlexScan dataset is quite obviously less dense compared to the VLX3's dataset, and Frank and I both spent about the same amount of time on site capturing data. The colorization of the VLX3 point cloud is, in my opinion, far superior as well. While both scanners use 20 megapixel fisheye cameras, the VLX3 uses 4 cameras and the FlexScan uses 2 cameras. NavVis also does a lot more processing in the backend to adjust the images they capture, which helps create a more visually pleasing experience. If we look at the panorama imagery from either sensor, we can see almost immediately the VLX has a fairly strong advantage on that front, which unfortunately for Z&F does translate into the RGB values of the point cloud. But how does that translate into meaningful data extraction for either point cloud? How does the poorer point distribution of the Z&F dataset affect the ability to create a 3D model? And how does the increase in fidelity of the point cloud from the Z&F help the dataset? To answer these questions, I turn to someone that has a heap more experience on the subject than I. This is Zachary Ashmond, a colleague of mine that I turn to whenever I have 3D modeling questions. Zach has been focusing on this subject for a number of years, who not only has a ton of experience in 3D scan data acquisition and processing, but also has a degree in architecture design that allows him to look at this topic from multiple angles. So you've seen the panoramas now, you've seen both data sets. Given the fact that there is a difference in quality of the colorization of the points and the quality of the panorama images, how does that affect you in the digitization of either data set?
In most cases, it really doesn't. So if we're dealing with creating like a full digital twin model where we need to know like this pipe is hot water running in this direction, we do need to have really high resolution images so we can make sure to read the tags on those pipes. But in most cases, we're doing as-builts. So as long as we have points that show the wall sits right here, we don't have duplications, that's the really important part. The panos are really good for like high detail modeling, and they do help a lot with gathering metadata. But ultimately, from what I've seen in both of those panos, they're usable in both cases.
Okay, so it doesn't affect digitization, but if you wanted to extract further metadata from the point cloud at that point, it could become an issue.
Yes.
Okay. There's an obvious contrast in both the density of points and the evenness of distribution. So the VLX dataset was subsampled to 5 millimeters out of Ivion, and on that site, it worked out to about 2 billion points. The FlexScan dataset was also subsampled to 5 millimeters, but because there is a lot of area in that point cloud, there was nowhere near 5 millimeter point density to begin with. We only ended up with about half, 1 billion points for the FlexScan. And as you can see, there's parts where there's just a severe lack of points. So within this specific case, how did that affect your ability to digitize either data set?
So looking at this wall right here, you might think like unusable, just with how few points there are. But as long as I can cut a section across on a low point and on a high point, that's how I check for plumbness. As long as I'm able to cut a section in those 2 spots, I can draw the wall. So you really don't need that many points. High decimation, not a huge issue. But ultimately, I was pretty happy modeling on the Z&F data. There's more than enough information for me to work with. I didn't model the entire garage, so I haven't done every square inch of it, but like from what I did, I didn't have any issues. Even when it came to like conduits mounted up against the wall, which is usually where I run into problems with SLAM data. It just turns into this mushy mess. And then that's where the panorama, like the panos, have to kind of make up for the point cloud data. In this case, I didn't need that. Like it was a clear enough round point that I was able to pull a radius, set that pipe, and send it up.
Okay, cool. Which actually, you bring up a great point about the conduit there. So I'm sure you also noticed the same thing that I noticed, where the VLX was much more prone to smoothing out features, smaller features, and complex geometry, and that the FlexScan almost resembled terrestrial scan data in some cases, and even exceeded. When I was cutting cross sections, it was very similar to the RTC in most cases, and in some cases, it actually exceeded it. When it comes to complex geometry that the algorithm of Ivion has smoothed out, are you still able to digitize the features that are supposed to be there, like you just mentioned with the panorama imagery, or is there any way to overcome that?
I wouldn't say perfectly overcoming it. It kind of depends on how bad the distortion is. So in most cases, you can, like if you're looking at what should be a round shape on a flat wall, kind of has this like groove to it.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty for the most part, you can pick that center point, and that is where the center of your pipe is going to be. So as long as the Ivion images are tight enough and aligned with the point cloud well enough, you can measure off that radius inside of the pano image, and you know where your placement is on there. So it's
So when you're measuring the radius in the panorama imagery, that's using the point clouds, or sorry, it's using the point cloud to measure that radius, but that point cloud is not a realistic representation of that pipe. So there's going to be some inherent error when doing that.
always.
Okay.
So like that measuring in the pano is kind of my starting point.
Yeah.
I drop my initial guess in place, and I look at how, like, you after you look at these shapes enough, like if you put a big ball on the table and you drop a sheet on it, like if you've dealt with enough juggling balls, like you know roughly how that affects the sheet sitting on top of it. So you can kind of guess exactly what size is on there. It's kind of the same thing in this modeling space. When you've dealt with enough SLAM modeling, you get to a point where you can kind of guess. It does have some consistencies where like you drop it in place. Sometimes your line is that thick, so all of this estimation is out the window, because if it's at the inside of it, it's an inch pipe. If it's on the outside of it, it's an inch and a half pipe.
Yeah.
So like it really is just a lot of guesswork and going back and forth, trial and error, try to make it fit. That's why typically with the VLX, we don't like to spec too high of an accuracy in our final models. You just never know what the final result's going to come out as.
You've seen a lot of SLAM data sets. This is the first time you've seen FlexScan data. What were your initial thoughts?
Well, my initial thought was actually kind of a PTSD response from another scanner that produces similar visual results.
BLK to go.
Yeah, to be okay to go. I saw those ropey slap lines, and I was like, "Oh no, oh no, what is this? What is this?" But as I started digging deeper into it, like it's really good data. Somebody else might look at one of these, like that funky corner that we were talking about, and be like, what the hell is this? And people have done facade drawings with total stations for a long time, where they only have like 20 points on that wall, and they have to draw the whole wall with 20 points. I've got thousands of them right there.
Yeah.
Like it's still a huge jump from where we were before. And like in all practical terms, you've got more than enough information on that wall to be able to say it's a plumb wall, it sits right here, and it's this thick. Like, what more do you need if you're trying to just get a general geometry model? If you're trying to do an actual layout of how the bricks are sitting, you're out of luck. You're not going to have enough information in this. And that's where the VLX would be much better, is if you're trying to do an actual like really tight detailed facade drawing and you need to see exactly where all the bricks lay, and like you want to start seeing where all the cracks are in concrete. That's where I think the VLX will shine as opposed to the Z&F.
But then we kind of get back into the fact that the VLX really tends to smooth out features.
Yeah.
So round and round we go.
Yeah. Back all the way back to terrestrial again.
That's right.
All the way back to terrestrial again. Just always ends up back at the tripods.
The more of these scanner reviews I do, the more I realize there probably isn't any chance of finding a single scanner out there that checks all the boxes. It seems like each one has their own unique pros and cons, which makes it really hard for me to say that scanner A is better than scanner B, and hands down, go with scanner A. So instead of trying to do that, I'll go over what I did and did not like about the FlexScan in regards to how it stacks up against the other scanners in its class. First off, the IMU in the FlexScan has really impressed me on the test sites I've used it on. I have another video out where I took the FlexScan to a treed area to see how the IMU and the SLAM algorithm could handle very challenging SLAM environments. And my expectations were exceeded. In that site and on this one, I noticed very little drift compared to the other SLAM scanners I used. On that treed site, I did everything I could to cause a SLAM break and I just couldn't do it. Now, I don't profess to be an expert in IMU technology, but before processing, there was a clear difference between the drift observed in the FlexScan's trajectory compared to the other SLAM sensors I used on that site, which leads me to speculate that FlexScan may have a hardware advantage when it comes to the IMU. The field capture app of the FlexScan is one of the best I've used. You can orbit the view in 3 dimensions while you capture data, which you cannot do with the VLX. It was easy to use, and I could see the path I walked for the entire dataset in real time, which was really handy for creating loop closures in my walk that were separated by a significant amount of time. The flexibility of the FlexScan has not been duplicated by another manufacturer as far as I know. Riegl offers a similar ability with some of their terrestrial scanners with the kinematic mode, but with a very important distinction. It uses constant GNSS corrections to correct the trajectory, and because of this, it only really works outdoors in areas with reliable view of satellites. You can go through short tunnels and under trees for short periods, but it cannot be used indoors. Emissen's STX also offers an extraordinary amount of flexibility in how it can be used, which we will explore in the next episode of Slam Wars, but it cannot be used as a terrestrial scanner. It's extremely easy to switch between SLAM and terrestrial scanning with the FlexScan. If you're using the backpack in SLAM mode, once you're finished, you rotate the quick release mechanism, pop the scan head off, and attach it to the supplied tribrac that has the same quick release on it. And as long as you have overlapping points or common control between the two datasets, they are combined when you process the raw data. And if you're using a dolly in SLAM mode, you don't even need to change the physical configuration. Simply end the SLAM dataset, stop moving, and take your static terrestrial scans directly on the dolly. When you're ready to SLAM again, start a new run and you're off. You can SLAM a project to quickly capture the majority of your data and double back to take filler terrestrial scans in areas with complex geometry. The processing isn't token-based. If you caught episode 1, you noticed this was my biggest pain point for me when dealing with the VLX. Not only that, but if you buy a Z&F scanner, you get a perpetual single-seat network license with lifetime support included for free. There is an optional yearly maintenance fee if you want to continue to receive updates in the software. To put the potential cost difference between the FlexScan and VLX processing into perspective, let's run some theoretical numbers. Let's say your VLX is collecting data 3 days a week for 50 weeks of the year at an average of 3 hours of collection time per day, or about 250,000 square feet. I don't think those numbers are too unrealistic for a company that is consistently busy. That works out to 150 days of datasets, about the size of what Frank was able to capture in his 3 hours on this test site. The test site dataset cost about $550 to process. So $550 multiplied by 150 days works out to $82,000 per year. Now, there are perks to processing an Ivion that I went over in episode 1, but $82,000 to process data is something to look long and hard at when weighing the pros and cons of which scanner to choose. especially considering how competitive this market is getting as more and more scanning service providers and SLAM scanners are popping up every day. When aerial LiDAR was just hitting the scene, service providers were able to charge an arm and a leg for that surface because competition was low. There was a time when there was only 1 or 2 people doing UAV LiDAR in my home province of British Columbia, and those guys knew they could put a hefty markup on their service, and it was still cheaper than traditional surveying for a lot of jobs, so it was still mutually beneficial for both parties. But as sensors became cheaper and knowledge became more readily available, competition increased, and the profit margins of those service providers decreased. I see that exact same scenario playing out in the world of SLAM. As the barrier of entry continues to decline, I'm curious to see if NavVis is going to be able to maintain their current pricing structure. And while we're on the subject of cost, this would be a good time to talk about what a FlexScan will set you back. If you get a top-of-the-line Z&F 5024 Supreme with the FlexScan 22, with all the software included, you're looking at about $140,000 US. Not cheap, but keep in mind you're getting the scan head, which by itself is competitively priced with newer terrestrial scanners, very close to Riegl's VZ600i in fact, perhaps even a little less. And you get the IMU to turn it into a SLAM scanner. If one were to get a VZ600i plus a VLX, which is the setup I'm currently running, you're well over $200,000. Not to mention all the pain points of having to deal with 2 ecosystems. But having 2 separate scanners does mean you can use both simultaneously on different projects. If the $140,000 price tag is a hard pill to swallow, they also offer the FlexScan combined with a version of the 5024 with less bells and whistles for $110K. One thing that was really refreshing about making this video in conjunction with Z&F was how transparent they are as a company. Before we started talking about this review, the word around the water cooler was that they had this reputation, and it was very nice to see it firsthand. When it came time to do the debrief interview with them, where I like to sit down and ask a laundry list of questions, there wasn't a single question off the table. I had a few fantastic conversations with the CEO of the US arm of Z&F, Jürgen Maurer, and he was very generous with his time and didn't hesitate for a second on any of my questions I flung at him. And finally, you get quite a bit of control when it comes to processing and filtering data. I myself prefer to have a high level of control when processing my data. This is one of the things I really like about using Riegl's RiScan compared to, say, Leica's Register 360. Once you learn the nuances of the software, it allows you more oversight of how the data is processed. You are able to tweak the settings to overcome issues in the data capture and get an output that's tailored to the way your team expects to see the final data set. All right, now time for all the things I did not love about the FlexScan. At the top of the list, ergonomics. This setup puts quite a bit of weight behind your center of mass compared to the VLX, which does a great job of distributing weight evenly on your shoulders and waist. The gyration of the scanner doesn't help either, and I don't love the fact you have $100,000 of scanner only protected by a single bumper bar underneath it. I'd say I'm a fairly stout individual, but after 3 hours of scanning with this unit on my back, I started to get pretty stiff. I have no problem scanning for 8 hours with the VLX. 8 hours with the FlexScan would be a serious chore. And after 3 hours of scanning, it had me reminiscing of my days of wildland firefighting, where we had to ruck the engines that powered our water pumps up the side of a mountain. While the trip down memory lane was fun, a multi-day project with the FlexScan could be difficult for your average surveying technician. That being said, I mapped about 250,000 square feet in 3 hours, so this wouldn't be an issue for most projects. And if you did have bigger projects, using the dolly or swapping out personnel is always an option. Now, I already touched on this, but the point density of the Z&F 5016 with the FlexScan is quite a bit less than the VLX, RTC, and VZ600i. All of the test site datasets I got back were decimated to 5 millimeters of point density and had about 2 billion points, except the dataset from the FlexScan, which was about half that at 1 billion points. And unfortunately, there was a very obvious uneven point distribution. Some areas were fine, others were sparser than I had hoped. Sure, you can make the argument if I walked slower, the point density would have been higher, but the capture time with the FlexScan was on par with the VLX, and the VLX had about double the number of points with a much more even distribution. The counter argument to this being an issue was made by Zach in the chat we just had. He brought up a few great points, but after we stopped filming, we kept on talking for a while, and the conversation turned to how a lower point density can affect one's ability to digitize complex geometry. While a sparse cloud isn't much of an issue on an 8-foot tall wall, it certainly is an issue on 1-inch conduit. Not that the FlexScan isn't capable of even and dense point coverage, it's more so that overall the point density was less consistent compared to the VLX, so if you got to an area requiring even and dense point coverage, you would just need to be cognizant of that while capturing the data. And there is good news on the horizon in regards to this. Z&F is currently working on a firmware update that will allow full use of the ability of the new Z&F 5024 Supreme that can capture over 2 million points per second, double that of the 5016. So if I recaptured the same site a few months from now, I could expect to see about twice the point density if I use a FlexScan paired with the 5024 Supreme. As far as learning resources go, Z&F does not have anywhere near the library of training materials NavVis has. Instead, they rely on direct-to-consumer webinars and virtual meetings as their preferred method of training. While this does have advantages in that they can answer specific questions and gear the training towards specific individuals requiring it, I'm just not a fan of this technique as being the backbone of conveying knowledge to customers. If I'm in the field and forgot how to tie control points or process data, I can jump online and access NavVis's learning resources 24 hours a day instantly. I don't need to schedule a meeting and wait for a reply to get a simple question answered. Coming from someone that makes a lot of training style videos, I know all too well it does take a lot of time and effort to create this style of learning material, but in my opinion, it's well worth it. Hopefully, they will start building up a library of videos in the near future. I received an introductory video when I got the FlexScan, but in all honesty, it was very rudimentary, and some of the pain points I felt in the field using the FlexScan could have been avoided by some higher quality detailed walkthrough style videos. When you finish a dataset with a FlexScan, it needs to transfer the scan data from the scan head to the IMU so that you can transfer it off the IMU when you're done for the day. In my testing, it took about 10 minutes for it to do this after every walk. I spoke to Z&F about this and they said 10 minutes to transfer data after each walk is not typical, so it's possible that I experienced unusually long wait times. But during this process, you cannot start a new scan. You have to wait for this process to finish before you can do anything with the scanner. And then when you're finished for the day, you need to transfer all the data off the IMU to an external hard drive. In comparison with the VLX, the data is being fed to the removable hard drive in real time. You don't need to wait in between datasets or at the end of the day. You can simply remove the hard drive without waiting any additional time for the data to transfer. It's not a huge deal waiting for the FlexScan, but it does slow things down. When you finish capturing a dataset with the VLX, you can go through the quality maps and get a top-down 2D X-ray view of all the points captured and the trajectory of the scanner traveled that dataset. This is extremely important for the in-field QC of the data collection for the VLX in that you can identify slam breaks and observe drift. The FlexScan doesn't offer the same kind of ability to QC the captured dataset in the field. There's a status bar that tells you if you're moving too quickly, and the firmware update is on the way that will display the estimated point density in real time, which is a very interesting feature, and I'm not aware of other SLAM manufacturers offering something like that right now. But I would like to have something similar to NavVis's quality map so I can do some QC before leaving site. The biggest issues I saw from the VLX data came from the fact that it merged individual walks together using a rigid adjustment. However, they have invested a lot of time and money recently into their new tool that takes a more nuanced approach at aligning one dataset to another. At this time, Z&F takes the similar rigid approach that NavVis currently does. Now, I can't say if this means they will see the same issues NavVis data has been susceptible to, but it would be nice if there was an option to do trajectory correction based not only on the data from a single walk, but also overlapping walks. The FlexScan comes in a fairly large case and the scanner comes in another separate backpack. And every time you want to use it, you have to assemble it and calibrate the camera, which is a bit more of a process compared to the VLX where you just unfold it and tighten two bolts. While I do like the quick release mounting style of the FlexScan, I was somewhat concerned each time I mounted the scan head to the IMU that it wasn't securely locked in place, and if a mistake was made, that's $100,000 worth of scanner that's falling onto the ground. It does have color indicators showing when it's locked in, but if you put that in the hands of someone inexperienced, the possibility of a costly mistake happening isn't zero. If someone made a mistake assembling the VLX, nothing's going to fall off and come crashing down to the ground. Two separate cases also means transporting it and shipping or checking luggage will be more costly, and general transportation is a bit more of a hindrance. The FlexScan uses black and white checkerboard targets to tie and control, whereas the VLX, along with other SLAM units, allow you to physically tie in control points. Now, there are pros and cons to this. The pro is you don't have to stop to tie in control points, but realistically, it doesn't take long to pop the VLX off and measure in a control point. As for the cons, you're stuck using black and white targets, and because you have a lot of weight strapped to your back, you cannot bend down and set a mini tripod and paddle as you go, which is hands down my favorite way to set checkerboard targets. So you're stuck having to either set adhesive scan targets on walls, which brings with it a host of other side effects, or setting all your scan targets up prior to scanning an area, which can be a little unrealistic depending on how much control you want to use. You can always utilize another crew member to bump scan targets ahead of you, but that ties up a whole other person, which is far from ideal. Luckily for this test site, I had a good number of black and white targets already established. Now it works, it's just not ideal. And if you're on a site that requires reoccurring scans, this is less of an issue because you would probably have permanent scan control set up already. So we now have two SLAM scanners reviewed and can start comparing some of the key distinctions between them to get an idea of which would be better suited for your needs. Some important features of the FlexScan are that you can scan terrestrially and use SLAM on the same site with the same scanner and process the data in the same software. It also does a fantastic job of preserving complex geometry. And I'm a huge fan of the fact that their processing software is neither subscription nor token-based and isn't done in the cloud, which can be an issue for some high security clients. Now with the VLX, it creates a beautiful dense point cloud. While paying for Ivion isn't ideal, you get the benefit of a very well-built online data sharing and visualization platform. The VLX allows you to physically tie in control points in the field, which is a big time saver. It has great ergonomics, and with their new tool coming out that takes a more nuanced approach at aligning overlapping data sets, the reliability will be much better soon. So which one should you buy? Well, only you can answer that, and hopefully I've given you enough to think about to make an informed decision. But just like last episode, I'm going to implore you to wait as SLAM Wars isn't over yet, and we got a very interesting sensor coming our way next episode. Until then, thank you all for watching, and as always, subscribe if you want, like if you feel it's warranted, and I'll see you next time.